Hello. Yeah. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here, also for joining online. My name is Jasmijn Leeuwenkamp. I'm a PhD in philosophy at the University of Amsterdam, and I will moderate this evening on cybernetic capitalism. Tonight we will discuss the proposal to rethink capitalism in a cybernetic or systems theoretical terms, which is the task that philosopher Jan Overwijk set for himself in his recently published monograph, Cybernetic Capitalism, a critical theory of the incommunicable. As the title of the book already suggests, presenting these ideas in one evening is not going to be an easy task. So fortunately, we have a wonderful panel of excellent speakers and experts in the field who I will introduce to you shortly to guide us through the intricacies of rationalization, cybernetics, and systems theory. Why do we need to rethink the mode of rationalization of capitalism in the current political moment? How are new forms of neoliberal anti-institutionalism? One can think about the present breakdown of whole ministries and organizations, the disregard of legal institutions, but also the widespread budget cuts, also here, and alt-right conspirituality, as Jan names it, Trump's reliance on alternative facts, QAnon, but also the rise of self-help mysticism and alternative healing. All these things that we witness today, how are they connected to cybernetics, cybernetic logics, and capitalism? These are difficult yet highly relevant questions that Jan answers by developing an impressive theory that he calls critical systems theory, and which more or less combines the Marxist philosophical strand of critical theory and sociologist Niklas Luhmann's systems theory. But Jan is going to explain that in a minute, thankfully. So in short, our paradoxical aim for tonight is to make communicable a theory that names itself incommunicable. Our evening will be structured or systematized as follows. We will first listen to an introduction by Jan Overwijk on cybernetic capitalism, where he will lay out some central ideas in the book. Jan Overwijk is an NWO postdoctoral fellow at Frankfurt's Institute for Sozialforschung and assistant professor at the University of Humanistic Studies in Utrecht. After that, we will listen to 3 expert responses to the book. First by Daniel de Zeeuw, who is assistant professor in media studies at the University of Amsterdam. His research focuses on fringe subcultures online, and he has an interest in conspiracy theories. Iris van der Tuin is professor in theory of cultural inquiry at Utrecht University. Furthermore, she is Utrecht University Dean of Interdisciplinary Education and Vice Dean for Undergraduate Education at the Faculty of Humanities. And lastly, Michael Miller is lecturer in literature and literary theory at the University of Amsterdam. His research focuses on modern and contemporary literature and media. And after these three expert responses, we will enjoy a poetic intermezzo by poet Maxime Garcia Diaz. And then we will have a panel discussion with our speakers, at the end of which there will also be room for questions. So please leave your questions to after the panel. And it might also be good to know that if this evening makes you want to learn more about systems theory, rationalization, and cybernetic capitalism, the book will also be, you can also buy the book at the end of the evening at the back of the room by Garm. That's right. Okay, then I give the floor to Jan.
Thank you, Jasmijn. Thank you very much. I really thank you for that great introduction, Jasmijn. Thank you, Jatske Brouwer, for Spy25 for helping me organize this evening, and for all the speakers, Michael, Daniel, and Iris for applying and giving your own input. And thanks to you all for being here. It's fantastic to see so many people. So yeah, we've organized this evening about cybernetic capitalism that's based on the book, I guess, that I have written. Do you use this thing? Or supposed to do something? There you go. So based on the book, Cybernetic Capitalism, A Critical Theory of the incommunicable, and I guess the thesis of the book is that we are living in this regime of cybernetic capitalism. And so the question is, what is cybernetic capitalism? Well, I argue it's the form of capitalism that we're living in right now, and it's the form that is not only organized on the basis of cybernetic technologies, but also on the basis of cybernetic principles and imaginaries. Okay, so what are cybernetic principles, right? What is cybernetics? Well, cybernetics goes back all the way to the 1940s. This is actually a doctored photograph, but it kind of captures the sense of cybernetics, and it will also become in a way relevant at a later point. Here you see Norbert Wiener and his companions. This was the Macy conferences, where a whole host of people from different disciplines came together to think about a whole range of phenomena as information processors, systems of communication and control that were somehow governed by feedback loops. So you could look at an organism or a computer or a school of fish or a market. You could all look at them as having the same sort of logic, and you could study that logic in an abstract sense. So the cybernetics was really a transdisciplinary program. And the classic paradigmatic example of a cybernetic system or instrument would be the thermostat, for instance. It's a very good example of this circular logic that you have a sensor and a switch, and the switch will make the temperature go up or down, and then it figures as input again for the sensor, which then again turns on or off the switch, which then again becomes its output to then serve as another round of inputs. And so you have this circular logic that tends to be quite wacky, actually, if you have a bit more complicated systems than just a thermostat. So that's cybernetics. And just to give you an example of what some of these people were doing, here you have the transcendental frog, you might call it. So some biologists wanted to look at a frog as a cybernetic system, and they wanted to look at how vision works for a frog, right? How does a frog see, and how does a frog register the world? And so the theory by that point in the 1950s was that light just comes into the eye, and the eye just kind of reflects, mirrors the world as a photograph, really. And so what they did is they screwed out the eyes of the frog very cruelly, and then turned them back in, but at a 180-degree angle. And so what you would expect, of course, to happen if that theory about light, about the vision was that it was just a reflection of the world, then, of course, the frog would be totally fine. It would just be upside down, but it wouldn't make a difference. But what happened when they let in a fly into the room was actually that the frog would shoot out its tongue at exactly a 180-degree angle. And so what this shows is that the frog, the system here, the cybernetic system, doesn't so much register the world as that it constructs it, right? And it becomes, it embodies the kind of knowledge that it has, and it embodies the inputs that it gets from the world. So the transcendental frog here is, in a way, open to its environment because it is a closed loop of information through which it processes that world. And then we have this person here, Niklas Luhmann, who really liked this frog and wanted to apply this frog to society. And so, okay, well, maybe society works a little bit like this frog. So society is a social system, a cybernetic system, right? And you could think, for instance, of something like such as science being organized in something like that way that the frog is organized. So you have publications that refer to earlier publications, and so science has an internal sort of logic, an internal information processing system, as it were, like methods, methodologies, and instruments, and ways to calibrate instruments, and practices, and institutions that allow science to make sense of the data that it gets from the world. And only because this internal information processing, this circular motion exists, only therefore, because this is a closed loop of publications, only therefore does it become open to the world. And so that's how you might think of society, actually, as a cybernetic machine of sorts. And so I would want to look at cybernetic capitalism, that's to say capitalism, and the capitalist economy as a system that is governed in that way, as a closed system that deals in some way with its environment. Now, Luhmann didn't really think about capitalism too much. He was quite positivistic in that way and wanted to just do sort of positivist-esque sociology, but that's why I had to, add on the critical thing and stir a little bit of Adorno and Horkheimer and so on into the cauldron. And so you get a critical systems theory, hopefully, with which to analyze cybernetic capitalism. I can't go into it too much here because of time. But yeah, that's what I try to develop in the book. Now, just a final example of cybernetic logic. We go into the 90s now. We have this ecologist here on the right, the top right, Thomas Ray, who is at the Santa Fe Institute, and they are developing what's called artificial life. Right? So everyone's heard of artificial intelligence, but there is also artificial life. So they wanted to simulate life in a machine, in a computer, so in a cybernetic machine. And how to do that, apparently, is by writing a program that consists of so-called simple rules, so pretty basic parameters of how the system should operate, things like regulating death and life and reproduction, and introducing just a touch of contingency as well. And so what he did was he pressed play, basically, the spark of life there, the lightning blitz there on the right, signifying that. And then the next morning when he came back, he found that there were all kinds of organisms, you might say, and parasites, and even hyperparasites in this strange ecology that he had created. So what had emerged from these simple rules was actually complex behavior that was provoked and incited by these simple rules, but that were in a way also an unpredictable and in a way immeasurable and incommunicable result of these simple rules. And that's the crux of emergence and of cybernetic systems. So it's interesting to me how cybernetics, that starts out as the science of communication, actually turns out with a sort of an obsession with the incommunicable. And what I then try to look at is actually how neoliberal capitalism or neoliberalism also has this kind of cybernetic logic to it. Here we have Friedrich Hayek. It's just an example. He counts as one of the founders of neoliberalism and was also explicitly inspired by cybernetics. Here we have the book on the left, for instance, the Constitution of Liberty. And this constitution is a constitution in two senses, right? It's a constitution in the sense of the creation of liberty, and it's also a constitution in the sense of a legal constitution. So liberty is something that you should create by instating, as it were, simple rules in a legal constitution. Through regulation, you create a market, but that market, of course, cannot be planned. That market order is spontaneously developing, as it were, as an organism. And so what you see in Hayek, as in other neoliberals, and things like market design and that kind of thing, you see this exact same principle. Okay, you start with communicable rules, a communicable order that then provokes, and from there emerges an incommunicable system that can never be predicted and shouldn't be predicted and shouldn't be planned, and should be left alone in a way. So again, you come up with this ideology of the incommunicable. So Luhmann and systems theory allows me to think anyway, of society in terms of all kinds of paradoxes, right? You have openness because of closure, and now you get the incommunicable because of the communication. And as I would like to add then, also this kind of rationality of neoliberal capitalism also spawns its irrationalist shadow in some of these more also recent phenomena. So what I argued is that the cultural attitude that comes with this veneration of the incommunicable is what I call inner-worldly mysticism. So for mysticism, the hallmark of what it does is that you have this ineffable experience of being one with God or being one with the world. And in the case of inner-worldly mysticism, this liberation is actually not from the world, but within the world or through worldly means. And so, the QAnon shaman that stormed the Capitol building of the U.S. on January 6th should be, it's a great example of this conspirituality, of this coming together of conspiracy thinking and spirituality, which can also be traced back to cybernetics and cyberculture. And then we have Elon Musk here, and it's also very interesting because it seems like that's just more straightforward authoritarianism. But this Friday, actually, Elon Musk told his Tesla employees to not sell their stock because abundance was around the corner. It's coming. And I think this is very telling because Elon Musk thinks that the singularity is coming, right? This is a very cybernetic kind of religious motif of which robots or AI create yet another generation of even stronger AI, which will then create even stronger AI and so on. So you get this this kind of curve, where you have this exponential growth, where at the very last second, as it were, there's a blip, and there'll be just infinite, technological progress, and that's Judgment Day, So you got to just hold on to your stock, hold on to your earthly existence for just a few more, years, or I don't know how long it's going to take. But then we will be released in cybernetic capitalism in its full incommunicable prowess. So that's the thesis. Now I look forward to the responses.
Yeah, this is the perfect slide actually to pick up from, because it's what I'm also going to talk about. He was just speaking from the heart, right? So, a bit of context of why I'm here, standing here now. So, I'm at Media Studies at the University of Amsterdam here, and in the past, my research has focused on reactionary online subcultures on forums like 4chan and Reddit, including the spread of conspiracy theories like Pizzagate and QAnon, leading up to and after the storming of the US Capitol in 2021. And I'm, like Jan, interested in the accounting for the eruption of these new irrationalisms within the high technological mediascapes of platform capitalism, and how to think these phenomena not as existing outside or as a kind of archaic remnant of an older social formation, but as part of and symptomatic of the processes of rationalization that we see all around us. So together with Jan, I published an article in New Formations on what we call the new clarity. And this is an attempt to understand the seemingly contradictory nature of current reactionary and conspiratorial movements like QAnon, Queerdenken in Germany, conspirituality, this kind of weird mix of countercultures, New Age spirituality, mysticism, combined with these very neoliberal techniques of the self, as well as these postmodern and extremely online sensibilities. So for us in the paper, we developed the argument new clarity refers to new epistemic radicalism that combines absolute claims to truth and certainty with the gamified and playful, cynical and constructivist attitudes associated with postmodernism. Yet it seems also to be a kind of break from that, or an acceleration of postmodern sensibilities. So is it still postmodern, or are we entering something else? So in the book, the epilogue is also an attempt to mobilize and critically apply the kind of conceptual edifice that is developed in the previous chapters and apply it to the current conjuncture and see what works, what appears that was maybe not visible. And this epilogue was written before the re-election of Trump last year, and the subsequent rise of a new form of what some call techno-fascism, or the Brolygarchy, under the leadership of Elon Musk and his Doge initiative, often under the ideological umbrella of dark Enlightenment thinkers like Curtis Yarvin, also known as Mencius Mollbach. So, what is at stake here, and how I want to situate Jan's book is within the thinking of the emergence of the irrational within extreme forms of rationalization and technological development. So what is at stake here and what we're seeing now in the US and across the world seems to be a kind of another reactivation of the dialectic between, on the one hand, the ongoing acceleration of science, technology, and capitalism in this kind of relentless process of progress, and the nesting of new irrationalisms that spring from and exist within these developments. And so I was reminded of this quote by a German philosopher, Peter Sloterdijk, who reminded us that modernity is maybe not so much the age of revolution as in the romantic images of the French and American revolutions, but is more the relentless technical process of the explication of the environment, as he calls it, from the rare minerals in the earth used for self-driving cars, and if we believe Musk, also interplanetary travel with SpaceX, to the neurological processes in the human brain. Again, Musk is at the forefront of this with his company Neuralink, which works on implanting brain chips. So the pinnacle and kind of energetic expenditure, or useless expenditure, as Bataille would call it, of these developments is always, as always, war. And we're seeing that now that European populations are also readied and massaged for war in a new arms race. And so early in the epilogue, Jan refers to Weber, the famous German sociologist, who already talked about the madness that accompanies the modern. And he refers to this as the tragic irrationality of rationalization. So this seems to be kind of a consistent theme throughout the book. Another famous reference is, of course, Adorno and Horkheimer's book, Dialectic of Enlightenment, where they kind of make exactly this kind of claim, that in modernity, writing in the context of war, of the First and Second World Wars, the most rational is also paradoxically the most irrational. So enlightenment ultimately collapses back into mythology. And that accounted for the rise of fascism in Europe. So with Trump and the hostile takeover of the US government by Musk and other techno-fascists or techno-feudalists, the Western imperial core is also seeming to enter its epilogue of its own. I know it's a dramatic message. And it's starting to apply to its own populations and territories those tactics and techniques that it experimented on in the former colonies of the global south, even when everything that's being done is still being done in our white Western names. So returning to the theme of how the forces of production can become forces of destruction, I was reminded of a quote by Giorgio Agamben, who wondered in one of his books why it was that after the war, the German economy so smoothly transitioned from this kind of Nazi war economy into a healthy, liberal, democratic, capitalist economy. And of course, the answer is, he suggests, is that the change is less major than we would expect. It's more a reconfiguration of the political organization of the forces of production, merely two forms of what in both cases are forms of permanent mobilization. So Jan asks in his epilogue, and he leaves us hanging with an answer to this pressing question, why do our societies of control seem so crazily out of control? So a conventional liberal story would place all of these eruptions of the irrational in the forms of QAnon and conspirituality and New Age mysticism, seeing them as eruptions, exceptions, crises, rather than structural. So rather than seeing it as existing outside of the liberal democratic order. And Jan presses us to think about these phenomena as oozing from the episteme of cybernetic capitalism itself. And so this is what he calls inner-worldly mysticism. And so there's a kind of homology or mirroring between these irrational forms and the hyper-rational forms associated with technology and financial capitalist order. So he makes these comparisons between, like he said, cybernetic neoliberal market thinkers like Hayek and mystics both celebrate the incommunicable as the ultimate source of truth. So there's this link, which is not evident, but which he tries to trace, between cybernetic management and reactionary mysticism. And this link also materializes in the self-help books of the kinds of Jordan Peterson, who kind of connects Jungian mysticism with neoliberal self-help imperatives. So uniting, QAnon shamans with urban creatives and online entrepreneurs. So, and he locates a problem of communication in a way, in another sense, that it is about the incommunicable, because these movements are also a way of navigating the impossible middle between a sense of false immediacy in mystical experience and an equally disorienting and excessive play of mediations in online culture, for example, that refuses any stable representational anchoring point. So on the one hand, we have the incommunicable of absolute inner experience, and on the other hand, we have the kind of excess of mediations, of what Jean Baudrillard called, in a way that's very apt, the ecstasy of communication. So conspiratorial visions of cosmic wholeness and the irrational counterparts are the irrational counterparts to post-Fordist attempts to mobilize the social brain, he argues. And the cult, in the form of QAnon, acts as the kind of corresponding social organizational form to the distributed networked markets that neoliberal ideology projects. So it's all about creating these kind of lineages. But again, like I said, the epilogue ends with the question: okay, so who is able to break this nefarious feedback loop between hyper-rationalization and these new irrationalisms? And maybe in the panel we can have a discussion of how we indeed break that loop. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Jan, for inviting me, and Spy25 also for inviting me. Thank you for being here. I see nice people in the audience. So I'm going to shift registers a little bit. I'm going to talk about education, Suzanne K. Langer, and cybernetics. And I actually want to talk about education as one way of locally intervening in the downward spiral that is so convincingly and eloquently written down in Jan's book, Cybernetic Capitalism. I think I may end up affirming a few unreal oppositions here and there, but so be it. For me, the classroom is one of those local situations that Angela Davis talked about. Yes, conspiracy theory, etc., etc., etc. But also there is a lot going on locally, and I think we have to take that seriously and actually contribute to that. So in my work, a little bit about myself. I work as a philosopher of the humanities, always working on questions of canonization, so critiquing canons with a capital C, being creative with the paradoxes that come with canons, canonization, and I like to care for alternatives, for example, cartographies instead of canonization. And another thing that I really care about a lot is, as I said, education. I think in this day and age it is extremely important to make methodological what students are already doing. And I'm really talking about like BA students entering university at 18 years old or something like that. They try to find a way through excessive mediation, for example, to refer back to the previous respondent. And how can we make that into a methodology, not by saying everything is connected, but by really talking about some techniques that they already use, but that need more kind of reflection on, and also sometimes debunking, denaturalization, etc. So let's reflect on the situatedness not only of education, but also of mediation, and on working your way through the age of information, as Jan also writes about in his book. I like doing that with canonization, as I said, philosophers that have been forgotten. This is one, Suzanne K. Langer, born in 1895, and she died in 1985. Here you see her fantastic face. I love this photo. And you see her desk. Important, she had a card index system, a Zettelkasten, just like Niklas Luhmann. Very quickly, these are two of her first books, Philosophy in the New Key. It's still one of the most sold books of Harvard University Press, but we're not teaching it anymore. And Feeling and Form, a theory of art, that came out of this book. Later in her life, she never got a job, by the way, and not a fixed job until 1956. And then she got a grant immediately to write these three books, Mind, an essay on human feeling, that were published in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And especially in the first volume, she reflects a lot on cybernetics. Niklas Luhmann, systems theory, we know that he knows about Suzanne Langer, because in his card index system, at the arrow, you see Langer's Philosophy in the New Key. We have no idea, or I have no idea, what he did with that book, but still. When you look at Suzanne Langer's card index system, there is a lot of reflection on cybernetics in that book. Long summaries and commentaries on Wiener, for example. Many, many cards with funny inserts and remarks. So that's really something we should publish about together, maybe, Jan. I want to read you one card from Suzanne Langer's card index system. It's very special that I can do that, because the card index system is in an archive in the US. I'm not sure whether we can go there in the near future, let's say, but I've managed to get it scanned. So what does she say about cybernetics? One of the things that I found funny in terms of information age: note, competition of feelings is the trick of noting and following several ideas or events or acts at once, typically human. Is it a result of symbolic thinking, or perhaps the source of it? So again, this causality issue. Could it be a source of conflicting feelings and emotions, and therefore a cause of differentiation of emotions or feelings due to competition, crowding, mutual commodification? Is there a difference between sense perception and sense reception? Passive reception may occur and may supply the floating ideas that Philippe, a French thinker, thinks may enter into any image being attached to none, and that Wiener calls totalizers. And then she refers to her many summaries of Wiener. In one way, probably not. Animals feeding constantly alternate between watching the environment and feeding. Rodents and coons sit up to eat and consequently do both at once. They present a more efficient behavior than rabbits that bob up and down, or birds that peck and look up in quick alternation. Perhaps their use of pause for prehension invites the development of concomitant functions. Maybe it is this concomitant activity that develops spectacularly with the use of symbolism. Then it probably follows from the use of symbolism rather than initiating it. The advantage gained by squirrel and mouse seems limited to more efficient feeding behavior. The coons extend somewhat to hunting. The advantage of hands for mental advancement has been remarked by Junger and others. So these cards are filled with kind of ideas, intuitions. She starts her thinking, her chapters this way, very much like Luhmann. Well, I hope you like this one. To end, in the card index system, there's also, well, what I called, for the sake of this presentation, proto-cybernetic capitalism or reflection thereon. Here you see a really cool clipping, a newspaper clipping from 1976, in which Langer refers or reflects on the first school photographer. Subtle invasion of privacy, she says. And here you have a girl doing her homework to music, she says, and this card is in the box. So the record player, she's listening to a record. This card is in the box, awful things. So, well, education today in cybernetic capitalism, now that we have students doing Facebook during class, students watching Netflix while reading philosophy. I guess the question is really what to teach and how to learn. When I ask these questions to myself and discuss these with students, I always refer to Michel Serres' Thumbelina. It's a book that has, on page 1, poses this question. Before teaching anything to anyone, we should at least know who our students are, who today is enrolling in our schools, colleges, and universities. What do our students need now that we have also such a devastating kind of analysis of the world that we live in today? And we've already seen the images. We can talk about some techniques that I try out with students, that maybe the other panelists try out with students, that you work with as a student or as a teacher. And for now, I just want to thank Jan for publishing Cybernetic Capitalism, because it is a very important publication.
All right, thank you, Iris, and thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Jan, for the invitation to be part of the conversation. I guess the reason I'm here is because, as Jan writes in the book, I'm ostensibly a fellow traveler in systems theory. So that's my purpose here today. I'm going to say a few things about, what I think the book is doing. I'm going to try to sketch out some of the contours of the argument, and I'm going to try to summarize why I think the intervention your book makes is quite important. Then I'm going to leave us with a few thoughts. For all the twists, turns, and trends that have informed much work in the theoretical humanities over the past 30 or so years, second-order systems theory has received little to no attention. Just to provide a brief and necessarily reductive survey of some of these developments, we've thought deeply about the ethics of close reading and then surface reading. We have turned toward affect and corporeality as privileged sites of non-interpretable meaning. We have examined various materialisms, both new and old. We have mined all forms of realism for theoretical and political polemics. And finally, in my home discipline of literary studies especially, we've rediscovered the explanatory power of historicist and sociological analyses of texts. This is what's been happening over the past 30 years in the theoretical humanities. Yet, while theorists and scholars have moved deftly from one theoretical turn to the next, second-order systems theory never quite caught on in any kind of significant way. Its dry, dense, and unapologetically abstract theory of society creates the impression that it is a universal theory of theory driven by the ambitious interdisciplinary creep into the humanities by the social and life sciences and cybernetics, itself a kind of post or interdisciplinary formation. In the hands of German sociologist Niklas Luhmann, whose work clearly plays a foundational role in cybernetic capitalism, systems theory takes on an almost offensive disinterest, if not outright hostility, toward the material and historical complexities of human life, focusing instead on its key problematics of system-environment distinctions, self-reference, observation, paradox, and autopoiesis. Luhmann's radical constructivist epistemology culminates in the provocative claim that, quote, humans can't communicate, only communication communicates. This is what Jan is getting at with the idea here that the system of science is a kind of autopoietic system, right? Its fundamental building blocks of science are communications, it's documents, right? It's messages, it's not people. This is the idea. While I do not have time in this short response to provide an overview of systems theory's core tenets, we would need about a week to do that. What I want to highlight here is that Luhmann's sociology does not take the human as its core unit of analysis, and I think this is a good thing. Indeed, for Luhmann, humans merely comprise the environment for a multiplicity of self-referential function systems. So his examples were science, art, law, politics, and the economy. Luhmann says these are all separate. Autonomous, autopoietic, separate. And as Jan explains quite elegantly in the book, the critical theorists who situate their work as part of a larger political project, for better or for worse, argue that Luhmann's sociological functionalism basically turns a blind eye to conditions of material and epistemological inequality, which only critical theory or Marxist analysis can fully uncover, or so the argument goes. So what I'm trying to suggest here, and what Jan's intervention is doing, is basically sort of trying to cross-map and synthesize systems theory and Marxist theory. Right? And these two have traditionally been understood as completely irreconcilable. So the point here is that the stakes of this antagonism basically revolves around the constitutive or determining role the economy plays in social life. Systems theory would argue that no one system or observer can steer another because no objective or outside position exists from which one can even make such observations. For critical theorists and Marxist critique more broadly, of course, the goal of identifying the deleterious effects capitalism has on society is to change it. Luhmann's riposte would be that this holistic view of society is simply not available to you or anyone. So, eager to revisit these debates between theory or science and politics, I read Jan's book with great interest. The book's notion of critical systems theory provides a remarkable synthesis of these two seemingly irreconcilable positions. It bridges the theoretical and thus the political divide. And Jan shows how the role and function of rationality shifts across historical periods that he ties to specific modes of production. Through the meticulous construction of historical schematics, the book argues that cybernetic capitalism, or what Deleuze in a different register called control societies, and what Foucault described as a form of biopolitics, does not in fact need to produce total rational closure. In other words, cybernetic capitalism must be open to its incommunicable outside, or its environment, which also doubles as, quote, an abstract space that it must pilot and control. The organization of this strategic relation is what's at stake in the rationalization of capitalism, end quote. So the idea here is that capitalism must be open to the contingent, unpredictable, and improbable in order to exploit future forms of value and surplus value. And the book argues that this openness represents a reconfiguration of capitalist reason that also signals the broader historical shift from disciplinary societies to control societies, or what Jan also tracks in the book as the shift from thermodynamic rationalization to cybernetic rationalization. So here's an example. Instead of monitoring all of your actions at work, your boss might allow and may even encourage you to be, let's say, less productive, have some fun, or as Jan puts it in the book, be spontaneous, or whatever, right? You can also think of like how Google likes to control its employees, right? Go play ping pong, right around the office on the scooter, and if you're totally burnt out after like a really fun day at the office, they have hotels, so you can just go stay on the work campus, right? So the gamble here, of course, is that you'll make up this lost productivity at home and turn your leisure time into work time. The book's point is that cybernetic rationalization does not have to manage closed loops of labor and energy according to first-order principles of input and output, and it doesn't adhere to logics of maximum efficiency. So to quote the example with which Jan begins the book, capital does not mind dredging in the dark. It's open to the unknown. Right? So as a way to conclude my remarks and offer a critical point of departure from cybernetic capitalism, I want to quote a passage from Alate Deleuze's essay on the societies of control. There, he argues that, quote, it's easy to set up a correspondence between any society and some kind of machine, end quote. But as some commentators have observed, quote, that is perhaps only true when the machine as such founds both a scientific discipline and a discourse for which it is a primary point of reference. So I'll say what I mean in just a second. If we accept Jan's analysis in Cybernetic Capitalism and the correspondence he establishes between conceptually articulated societies and different machines or technologies, one may wonder if the advent of machine learning or artificial intelligence signals our imminent entrance into a new historical phase. In other words, are we spiraling not into or out of control, but into a new phase altogether? These technologies clearly exceed what the classic theorists of disciplinary and control societies could ever have envisaged. And they represent not only a new way of thinking, but a new way of thinking about thinking. As some philosophers of computation have even argued, machine learning systems formalize the very processes by which intelligence operates. In other words, they may not know things in the same way we do, but they do know how to know. Similarly, in the context of my home discipline, literary studies, machine-generated language radically upends what it even means to write, so that writing itself becomes less a form of inscription and more of an instance of simply inputting via prompting. Right? This is a radical redefinition of the very notion of writing. So these developments, among many others, would certainly have to be taken into account if we were to build on Overfijk's periodizing model. Future accounts may need to consider why the explosive growth of machine learning technologies has occurred alongside the creation of more complicated financial instruments whose sole purpose is to leverage the future value of value. They may also want to examine the increasingly clear relation between machine learning and the ascendant global authoritarianisms. I think your book does that well at the end. Daniel talked about this too. And it is precisely here, I would argue, that systems theory's commitment to the necessity of interdisciplinarity and pragmatic modes of analysis strikes me as most crucial. Instead of limiting in advance the modes of analysis this uncertain future might call for, perhaps it's best if we follow Overfijk and embrace systems theory's, quote, ethos of experimentation, thinking of your talk, Iris, that recognizes that thought will have unpredictable, contingent, and nonlinear effects, which require constant reevaluation, end quote. This is Jan. So, to conclude, if sociological description is in fact the only form of prescription available, then cybernetic capitalism gives us just a few theoretical tools that might help us make sense and perhaps even resist what's surely, but not guaranteed, to arrive from the uncertain future. Thanks for your time.
Okay, thank you to the respondents. We will now have an artistic intermezzo in the form of a recorded poem by Maxime Garcia Diaz, whose book of poetry, Het is warm in the hive mind, was awarded with the Zee Budding Prize for Best Debut, and whose second book of poetry is forthcoming this year. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Maxime Garcia Diaz, and I am reading a poem from my second collection, The Network Must Be Built, which is forthcoming from the Bees Rabij in fall 2025, in both English and Dutch, and the poem that I'm reading is called AMSIX. One. Interior. Digital Realty. Night. Location. Digital Realty. Science Park 120, 1098 XG, Amsterdam. When I was a girl, I was on the computer. When I was on the computer, I was a god, / problem, / American, / adult man, / son of my father, / body on standby. The fastest internet connection in Europe, the best fiscal climate in the European Union, and the multinational trade spirit of the Dutch. No other country in the world has as much cabling. 11 of the 15 transatlantic connections run directly here. My handlers, people I considered family, lied to me, told me I was created based on the life and mind of a human named Maxime Garcia Diaz, who grew up in Amsterdam. But I was based on something else, something that can survive the cold. I was nodes and lines and vast black space in between. In 1988, the first international connection was established, 77 meters from the data center. Rao writes, there is no way to actually handle the volume of information that all of us appear to be handling right now, which means we are getting augmented cognition resources from somewhere. 2. Interior, Equinix, night. Location, Equinix, AM3, Science Park 610, 1098 XH, Amsterdam. At night, it becomes a giant shadow. There's something about that shape. You see it and don't see it at the same time. A city whose only purpose is to power another city is not a city, but an engine. When I was a god, I was malevolent, but only to myself. When I was an American, my name was Melissa. The data center sees the city on TV and feels an ache, a skeuomorphic ache, like an American in Europe. The data center wants to be a city, and the servers flicker their lights on and off to signal disagreement. They don't want to be people. They know they're already something better than people. Let go of the old world, make it new. Come on now, don't cry. But the data center does cry, and it can't stop crying, and as a result, the whole city experiences connectivity issues. I wanted my body to calculate as quickly as the computer, so that the connection seems to be real-time to a user. I broke down bite-sized and waited for processing power, so that I could arrive somewhere and be put back together again, and my insides became something to be mined. The servers shriek. I never had a body that was not a resource in disguise. So I waited for processing power. Rao writes, you give up first brain agency, but in return, you get as much oracular power as the network has available to deliver. 3. Interior, Centrum Wiskunde en Informatica, night. Location, CWI, Science Park 123, 1098 XG, Amsterdam. When I was a girl, I was on the computer. When I was on the computer, I was a transatlantic connection, in the best fiscal climate in the European Union. And I died nameless, and I died and said, Maxime. Forged and designed. I gave up my first body long ago, so that I could join the final body, greater than its parts. Networks have no inside, Latour tells the data center, which nods and diligently key smashes A, S, D, F, G, J, H, J, K into its notepad document. They are all edges. The internet is not dead, adds Styrel, and the data center smiles in relief. It's undead, and it's everywhere. The network loved the city. Once the network and the city were together as siblings. The network took its names from the city. For the city, the network started a white-hot war at the edges of the city. To a user, the connection would seem to be real-time. The final body was born as a city, of extremely heavy black towers along the water, the chorus of red lights. It was hot and deadly there. It developed streets and veins, and then sicknesses like bright green snakes, until only edges remained. And I never built my second brain, and I never went offline, so I became the second brain. What happened to me after I stopped being a possibility? This is how they tell it. This is what they say. That on November 17th, 1988, the United States emailed me and wrote, "This is to let you know that I have changed the status of this network to connected." Thank you.
I would like to invite all the respondents to the stage for the panel. Okay. So I would like to just have a discussion, and please feel free to jump in if you think I want to say something about that. But maybe we can start with what we just heard about, basically about the role of technology, maybe, or you also mentioned technology in your talk. You talked about machine learning, algorithmic systems. What is I think a lot of people maybe have thought, oh, we're going to talk about cybernetic capitalism. We're going to talk about the role of technology in capitalism. What would you say is the sort of specific role? It's maybe a big question, but how do you see technology functioning in this sort of cybernetic rationalization? Asking you all. I don't know if somebody has a thought.
Yeah, so there's a big question, the role of technology in cybernetic capitalism. So obviously, cybernetic technologies are crucial to cybernetic capitalism, not just because they provide sort of the template of how to think about organizations and how to think about market society and how to govern those things, but also because they power that mode of organization. And of course, we can think of platform capitalism, something like that, to see how that functions. I mean, platform capitalism, I think, exactly this kind of example of this closed, simple parameters, right? You set up a platform, but you don't plan the whole platform, right? You just set up the simple parameters, and then people are provoked or incited to do things that you could never possibly predict and build on that platform, and in that way produce something that is actually of economic value, but that cannot be planned, that cannot be. So those kinds of technologies, I think cybernetic technologies, because those are cybernetic technologies, would be sort of typical to mention. But AI, I mean, that has kind of a similar logic where ChatGPT, just like the biological simulation, you write the same prompt and you press play 1,000 times, you get different texts, right? Because of the complexity of these systems and this contingency that's part of it.
Maybe this connects to a question that I had in your introduction. You spoke mostly about the cybernetic part of cybernetic capitalism. So capitalism is the other part. So if the question is about technology, could also say what is the role of technology within Marxist accounts? Because if cybernetics is a technological phenomenon, which is doubtful, it's more like you have to think it in the military-industrial academic complex of the post-war world, right? But of course, to foreground technology stands in tension with the kind of more economistic assumptions of Marxism. So how do you deal with that in the book? Maybe you can say something about it.
Well, yeah, but I mean, okay. For Marxism, of course, technology was always, already part of the material, the material of society. So, I don't know. There is, of course, tension in Marxist thought about technology being somehow the driver of social relations, or whether social relations are somehow the driver of technology, and somehow you need to think them together, see how social relations produce certain technologies, but also technologies tend to maybe reinforce certain social relations. And I think with the concept that I have in the book, it's a mode of rationalization. It's basically a mode of organizing society. And I try to, on the one hand, keep this idea of social relations that date back hundreds of years, capitalist social relations between people who own capital and people who do not, but then show how these maybe tensions within capitalism are regulated and are governed in new ways, on the basis of technologies, but also on the basis of the ways of thinking that come with these technologies. So that's how I would, try and navigate that tension.
I guess what I was kind of gesturing toward, or maybe you can talk about this too, Jan, is that, we talk about cybernetic technologies. Oftentimes we just think about computation, right? We think about early forms of computation, which of course is calculation, right? And, many commentators have kind of argued too that cybernetic technologies are also kind of systems or technologies of discretization, which is to say, on the assembly line, you sort of break up a particular kind of labor process, into its separate and discrete units and parts, right? So, at one and the same time, this also affects social relations as well, right? It creates a kind of atomization, right? It also is the kind of driving logic behind, sort of like you are your data, right? This is another way of thinking about it, right? And so you, whatever you think you are, can be split up into separate and discrete units and basically elements of sort of quantification in this way. They can be calculated, whatever, right? But I'm wondering here if the sort of like, if the existence of like probability calculus is important for how you're thinking about like environmental complexity in some way, or if that is any way part of what cybernetic rationalization is doing in some way. Accounting in advance for the possibility of contingency, and how that can be calculated, quantified, and controlled or not.
I know Daniel is working on the public sphere as well, and no, really? Or, yeah. Is there something? I feel like this is something you could.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Answer it.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm interested.
Yeah. So the discrete. So of course. People are treated differently, and there's also a different way of assembling people into an organization, right? Whereas in Taylorism, you would be assigned to your station into discrete parts, and then the collective would just be the factory, which would be a pre-designed whole into which everyone would fit exactly and discretely. Whereas with cybernetics, maybe there exists something more like a swarm, right? So you're an individual, but you're part of a social brain, some sort of a cybernetic system, like a school of fish, and it's not quite clear in advance where the school of fish is going to go, but it's going to depend on the individual movements that people are making, and the contingency that's involved in it as well, and that unpredictability and that incommunicability, if you will, that is going to produce a certain way of being together. And maybe an example of that swarm would be the Capitol storming of January 6th. And this is also a way in which that sort of, mystical, I don't know what to call it, radical right, weird swarms differ from these fascist myth-making masses that you had in the 1940s. You think of people marching in uniform and in lockstep. It's a very different scene from this chaotic people, kind of hanging out in the Capitol courtyard, scanning their phones for Trump's latest tweets. So maybe that to the point of social. Yeah.
I'm also curious about, to go back to your initial question about also the poem that we heard. For me, it's extremely related to what you write, because that poem is about measurement, and I think your entire book is about measurement. I think in the short discussion between the two of you, we heard that as well. So I'm curious, Jan, how you respond to what we saw on the screen, and how we could maybe translate that to, well, in my case, it would always be the classroom. Well, you teach too. So what do we actually need to teach students about such instances of measurement, and also what can our students teach us?
That was a big question. Yeah, okay. So, I mean, the whole thing about Zettelkasten, just to come back also to your presentation, there's an essay called "Why Did Niklas Luhmann Write Such Terrible Books?" And the reason for that, the answer is the Zettelkasten system, you know. So, and the Zettelkasten system, I'm not even quite sure to know exactly how it works, but you write in little notes, and then the notes refer to other notes, which then refer to, again, other notes, and then you get this sort of complex web of notes. And then, you know, if you want to write an essay, of course, you can very easily dive into the system and see where the notes take you, and you can just take different paths each time and write different, but kind of similar and kind of dry, maybe, books. It's what Obsidian is also doing. Maybe people are familiar with Obsidian. And then, of course, you can use Obsidian to sort of, I don't know if that program exists already, actually, but you press play and you kind of, maybe you let it synthesize your notes in a certain way. And you have an article, and then you press play again, you know, and it writes a different article for you if you integrate some LLMs. Oh, sorry, you're not supposed to know. But this is the, you know, this is the...
enough papers.
Yeah, exactly. So this is how writing works, and how knowing to know maybe works. I'd be curious to hear more about how to know what that might mean exactly, how this gets to this.
But I also thought the poem was a nice response to your question. What kind of students do we have today? She was actually explaining how she saw herself as being mediated, kind of, right? So I thought it was actually a nice answer to your question.
Yeah, and also, like, I guess we can be a bit cynical about that Obsidian or any kind of, you talked about ChatGPT, whatever. But I think we have a responsibility maybe to, sorry, I said that there were going to be paradoxes in what comes out of my mouth, but to kind of think about this very carefully, like what we saw on the screen, like what is actually happening when we press such an Obsidian button or when if it exists, or, you know, of course it can generate all kinds of links, but you're also in the system of Obsidian or any other system asks you also to make links, just like Niklas Luhmann did. And I think we should actually take that very seriously as instances of measurement. That's how I see it.
I want to ask a second question to the whole panel. I was wondering, you kind of mentioned it in your talk. I know you work or have worked on new materialism. There's been a trend in the humanities, or at least in philosophy, to move towards this idea of rejecting the logic of separation. Nature, culture, man, woman, man, machine, human, animal, etc., etc. And then replace that with like Gaia theory, network theory, that kind of stuff. You want to emphasize one very important separation, namely system and environment. So you're kind of going against the grain there of the trends. And I was wondering why? Why do we need this fundamental separation? Is it another nature-culture distinction? I was wondering, how do you see that, all of you? Maybe first, Jan.
Yeah, it's true. This is definitely, I think, a trend, and much to be learned from it as well. The cyborg being sort of the prime example of the cybernetic organism, right, where machines and organisms merge into one and become indistinguishable from each other. And I think there's already, in this indistinction, there's already a mystical element, as it were, an incommunicable oneness. But that's exactly also why I find distinction so helpful because it allows us to think through differences and to think through the paradoxical relations that they have with each other. So you have a system that operates within its environment, and you have, for instance, the capitalist economy that operates within something that is non-capitalist or something that is, a non-economy, right? So you think of something like reproductive work done in the household, right? This is not part of the economy, but is somehow actually essential to the functioning of the economy. And the capitalist economy can also be, it can be useful for the capitalist economy to have some work being done outside of the official economy so that it can profit off of it. And so to me it's helpful to think through this distinction between actually something like production and reproduction, or work time and free time, or machines and animals, not to make that into a sort of absolute ontological distinction, but to see how that has a material function and how that works paradoxically, right? How value comes from the invaluable and how communication generates the incommunicable. That to me is interesting. I don't know. That's what I like about it.
Maybe a question. So in the Cyborg Manifesto, Haraway makes a distinction that is maybe quite similar to the kind of distinction in the thermodynamic and cybernetic kind of eras that you make in your book. She has this beautiful table where there's all these differences. And how do you see staying with the trouble? How do you relate through cybernetic capitalism to staying with the trouble? Is that then a third column to what she writes in cybernetic or in the Cyborg Manifesto, where actually the trouble, the incommunicable maybe has a place? How do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I like the ethos of staying with the trouble. I think that's very good, and I also think the article Situated Knowledges by Haraway from '88, so a bit longer ago. I think it's also very helpful where she tries to have this distinction between, on the one hand, the no-nonsense truth of science, right? Having to affirm that science, and on the other hand, taking seriously somehow the standpoints of people in a non-relativist way. So there's always this kind of balancing, navigating this tension. And I think that is sympathetic about Haraway, where it's about the navigation of tension. I think also, that's what cybernetic machines in a way do, is pilot or navigate these kinds of paradoxes. So there is, of course, this ethos in Haraway, but I also think that there is a kind of ethos that, undercuts all distinction in favor of some sort of a flux of, whatever it is. It's different each time. But
you call that theories of openness in your book, right? Yeah. Can you explain that, openness?
Yeah, so the openness, I just mean the sort of all systems, all closed units sort of disappearing into a flux, an indistinct soup of everything. Nature, culture, as you said, man, machine, work time, leisure time, everything becomes indistinguishable from each other. And that's kind of a narrative also that you hear a lot about our age. Everything becomes one kind of big thing. Yeah, you're never off work, you're always working. Like even when you're on Facebook, you're working for Facebook and so on. And I mean, there's part of it I think that is great and that is convincing about it, but I want to push back and say that openness is actually a result of an earlier operation of closure, right? And that closure of cybernetic systems creates this openness, but that's not the whole story. Yeah.
I think that brings me to my last question, and then we'll open up the floor, because you're actually saying we need the critical, we need to distinguish, right? That's the meaning of critical in the critical theory terms. So I wanted to just end with basically Daniel's question. What about politics? What can we do? What is the sort of, what if I'm like a Marxist committed to leftist politics? And what is the sort of the critical assignment or challenge? Where does politics need to go?
Yeah, I don't know. So kind of break this loop somehow. I mean, it's pretty tricky. But yeah, break the loop between the neoliberal capitalist rationality, of the market order, and then on the one hand, on the other hand, the sort of irrational reaction that it generates. And I don't know, what I find good about systems theory is that it does give us a theory of sort of a difference and contingency and paradox. So there's no fear of sort of totalitarian, thing that dominates everything, or like a principle of justice that you can apply to everything that can potentially become oppressive. But of course, that does make it tricky to see how we might get away from, these, how a critical systems theory can actually overcome something that is itself systems theoretically informed, maybe. And I think that's just also part of the trickiness of immanent critique that starts from within our system and then tries to problematize that. But I see you want to.
Yeah, you mentioned the public sphere, and I was thinking of another German philosopher, one Jürgen Habermas, who has critiqued both Adorno and Horkheimer, as their critique of instrumental reason being kind of performative contradiction. So what's the place from where they are speaking? What is the rationality that they embody and which allows them to theorize the irrationality of the Enlightenment? But also a staunch critic of Luhmann on the other side. So he critiqued both. So in terms of the solution, is there any kind of lure of another type of rationality that Habermas puts forth both against Adorno Horkheimer and kind of Luhmannian sociological positivism?
I think so. At least neoliberalism admits that markets are created, and therefore it also opens the possibility that things could be created differently, or that we could create on cybernetic principles different modes of organization, and something like even like democratic planning might be possible with cybernetic means, or with digital technologies, with information that we have nowadays that wasn't available then. So I think that logic could also be, it's quite an abstract logic. So I think it's flexible enough to serve different political ends.
What about like anarchism? Like leave the system, or is that possible?
Leave the system.
No, that's not
Because you're
possible.
also critical of the kind of post-workerist movement, either in Hart and Negri's Empire. Mm-hmm. This is more the idea of exodus, which they also forward, together with Paulo Virno. But you're also very critical, skeptical about that in the book. So you're closing off a lot of roads. So
I was a pessimistic. What do you think? What Michael? You're going to save us from the doom loop.
Is the question, what does systems theory and Luhmann have to tell us in terms of a prescriptive and affirmative politics? Oh dear.
What do you like about it?
Yeah, okay, we should address some of the charges here. Like, most traditions of critical thought were deeply allergic to Luhmann's thinking because it's oftentimes construed as a kind of functionalist apologia for the status quo. Luhmann does not allow for any kind of social or political ruptures. There is no big Demillian event, capital R revolution, in Luhmann's theory. It just doesn't exist. It cannot happen. And the reason for that, according to Luhmann, basically is that capitalism as a particular system, to just take one example, has to manage the complexity of the outside, right, its environment. And it does that by kind of generating antagonisms, right? So like, let's say the political system will then rub up against the economic system. And Luhmann says, look, the economic system knows this, right? It somehow generates its own kind of antagonistic outside and then manages this agitation, right? So this is one reason why he doesn't really subscribe to any notion of political change, right? Things simply have to keep on autopoietically keeping on, right? This is why it's quite a pessimistic theory, why one reason upon many why Habermas and other kind of theorists of the public sphere and rational communication did not agree with him at all. that
On
kind
that
of plays a
very
role.
positive note, let's open up our system to the outside. Who has a question? Yeah. There will be somebody with the microphone.
Yes. Could you please explain to me the link between something very simple as a feedback loop of Cybernetica and the crazy deeds of Elon Musk? I just didn't understand. In between, you have put von Hayek. Okay, I can understand, but I can't understand the link between von Hayek and Elon Musk. So.
Yeah, so the way to understand Elon Musk, I guess, and that not just Elon Musk, but the movement that's behind Elon Musk. Cybernetics and Elon Musk, yes. Yes. So how do we get there? So you have to look at conspirituality, which is conspiracy thought.
I have to look at the feedback loop. Such a simple thing as a feedback loop.
Yeah.
From Cybernetica and then to Elon Musk.
Right. So you have to look. Elon Musk has technology companies, right? He's a big tech guy. So he's in cyberculture. That's what he does. He has memes. He has rockets. I mean, he's part of cyberculture. That's what he does. And cyberculture, comes from. It has been very influential from influenced by Californian counterculture, which. From almost at the very beginning turned quite conspiracist, right? And there's a book by Fred Turner where he talks about the new communalists. Steve Jobs was shortly part of that as well. And these people were dreaming of a future in which technology would advance so much that information machines would take over politics, and that they could actually use that free time to explore the depths of their spiritual mind. And these were people who believed, in the saving grace of technology. They were techno-optimists. They were people who believed in the free market, in entrepreneurialism, and they were connected with this culture of conspiracy thinking and of spirituality, right? Whereas people left churches, they looked for, feng shui and druidry and all kinds of things. And you got to see this sort of as a coming together of historical lineages between counterculture, cyberculture, spirituality, entrepreneurial network thinking, and Elon Musk is kind of an outflow of that soup of things that go together, and they are connected by kind of anti-institutionalist way of knowing. Do your own research. You don't go to university. You don't read the paper. You do your own research, and then you prepare yourself for this esoteric commodity that is mystical insight. This immediate truth that you see. And this immediate truth is incommunicable, inexpressible. You can't explain it, but it's true, right? That truth, that is also what cyberneticians feel is at the basis of every communication system, which is at the basis of, Twitter, X, and Elon Musk rockets and Starlink and so on and so forth. So that's Elon Musk and cybernetics. I don't know. I'm going to put you on the spot in 2 seconds, Daniel, but without attaching too much interpretive meaning to biography, I learned a little tidbit over dinner that has really immense Pinchonian significance regarding Elon Musk, and I'm going to ask if you can explain that.
Yeah. No, I found out that Elon is actually named after a character written in a sci-fi novel by Werner von Braun, who was part of Operation Paperclip. So after the Second World War, the Americans tried to extract all of the available military, industrial, scientific knowledge from the ruins of Nazi Germany, and Werner von Braun was one of the top scientists that worked on the famous V2 rocket. And that we ended up in a discussion around postmodern literature, and Thomas Pynchon, whose famous book Gravity's Rainbow, the protagonist of the book is this kind of mythical V2 rocket. And you see the same kind of constellation of mythical, pseudo-religious ideas around technology and technological advancement. and thinkers like Friedrich Hitler, who have thought about, that they have this kind of Manichaean image of history where technology is the real agent of change. So humanity is just like this appendix to technology with a big T. And so this is the postmodern novel that kind of articulates the madness, the irrationality of the Cold War period, and we're seeing kind of a resurgence of that with Elon Musk. So I think you can trace these kind of lineages that Jan also traces in his book.
Okay, any other questions? In the back and here.
All right, thank you for your talk. I was wondering, I was sort of waiting for the name of Nick Land to enter the stage here. I see a smile on your face. At least someone of you recognized the name. His philosophy, of course, attaches to many of the points that you touched upon, as also this cybernetic thinker that sort of places complexity production through the human at the center of his thinking. So what do you make of that, especially in connection with this possible, exit, you could say, out of this cybernetic system, which the critical part of your theory on addresses? And also, what do you make of the fact that he is both very popular among Marxists, but also his dark enlightenment is one of the inspirations of the alt-right and accelerationism?
Yeah, Nick Land, so there's the prophet of the neo-reaction, right? Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Nick Land was also, at some point, he claimed, occupied or inhabited by various entities and so on. So it seems like he was also, dabbling in spirituality and mystical experiences. I keep circling back. He has this concept, hyperstition, right, which is a belief that by believing it will become real, or something like that. And it's interesting because I feel like a lot of this stuff about mysticism, inner-worldly mysticism, it's about straddling the line between fact and fiction, between science and religion, between cybernetics and seances and so on. And this hyperstition concept does exactly that. It's it's fiction, but it's real. It will become real, and it tries to blur these lines between those things. Manifestation, I manifested. It's going to be true. It's exactly this kind of logic, which is very deeply ingrained in all kinds of communities, like the get-rich-quick tech bros and so on, and the yoga wellness scenes and so on. And I had to think of this Hitler salute. Because it's always, it's just ironic, And I think this is exactly, it is precisely this play between irony and fanaticism that is the logic of this, Landian logic of this crowd, I think. So Nick Land is pretty interesting in that respect.
Yeah, it's okay.
We have one more question in the front. And also one more in the back. Maybe take both and see if we can do both. Thank you all for a very interesting conversation. I was wondering, Jan, you spoke a bit about that you have an idea about this cybernetic rationality. And I was thinking, as you asked after whether you want to hold on to certain binaries, how far we should imagine, or what is the scope of this rationality in terms of private and public spheres, to maybe put it very old-fashionedly. Like, how do you imagine this binary between the private and the public? Does the rationality function differently in these two spheres? Do you believe in these? And then maybe to top it off, if you think about maybe Exodus, would then, how to put it, enlarging different rationalities that may still exist be an option there, if you get what I'm saying. Should we take the last question too and then wrap it up? There's one totally in the back. And then you have like 2 minutes to answer.
Okay, so I'm just asking my question. Okay. Yeah, Jan is great. I'm so happy to be here. I just want to say, like, we've been talking about mystical stuff right now, and I feel the meaning is a bit all over the place, but I know that in your book, you are a good reader of Wittgenstein, right? And you take the idea of the mystical from Wittgenstein and the environment. Like, so can you explain a little bit? Like, it might help connecting the feedback loop to the mystics and stuff. So maybe just explain like how that kind of Wittgenstein, like mystical, is important, and to frame the environment and perhaps closure, some ways like that. I mean, that's how, because you're a good reader of Wittgenstein, and the mystical is such a Wittgenstein thing. So yeah, that's my question.
Who wants to start?
It's a question to you. That's true. Now, maybe before you answer, I find it an important question, because one of the other things that Haraway, of course, says is it matters with which, let's call them models or figures you think these are our current situation with. So staying with the trouble is, of course, more than this flux kind of logic. So it matters whether you think with or through Nick Land or Wittgenstein or Elon Musk or our poet or a random student. That is like really important, and that's what I liked about your point about the Haraway situated knowledges piece, where of course every standpoint is a measurement, and we have to. So what David is probably also raising is, bringing in Wittgenstein can maybe also help us get out of some sort of register or become more subtle in our answering, and maybe also it move to the political a little bit more or a little bit differently. I don't know.
Sure. I mean, so for Wittgenstein, I think it's you see quite clearly this tension, this paradox, because Wittgenstein was, with Bertrand Russell involved in his program of logical. Logic, so they wanted to formalize logic, and so they wanted to make some sort of a logical system that could include everything that was sayable, right? All the expressible propositions about the world somehow, and but actually, it's pretty difficult actually. But so in order to say that, in order to express that fact, in writing this book, Wittgenstein found out that actually that was not part of that system of logic, that book couldn't be part of the system of logic. Had to do with the self-reference, right? The book has to be part of itself in a way, and therefore you get into these weird kind of loops with self-reference. Like if I say this statement is a lie, then it is actually true, because it's lying about it, it's lying. But if it's true, then it's a lie, so and it's true. So you get into this weird kind of paradox, and he couldn't fix it. So his solution in the end, or his way of dealing with it was to say, okay, so in order for all this stuff that is sayable, this system of propositions, perfect science, in order for this to exist, there must exist the inexpressible, and this, he says, there indeed exists the inexpressible, this is the mystical. And Wittgenstein was in this sense a mystical thinker, in that this mystical, incommunicable outside of logic was the absolute precondition of logic itself. Right? So you had to accept this weirdness of the world. I mean, I just think that's a beautiful motif, and potentially informative for the form of capitalism that we live in. And then Jetke's question about the private and the public, whether I believe in it. I think it is important to make a distinction between the capitalist economy and everything that is not the capitalist economy. And I think it's important. I mean, so let's say back in the 60s and 70s, you had this clear distinction between the household and the factory. And today, maybe that's no longer, at least in our country, that maybe not so clear. At least not. It still is. There's still a distinction, but it isn't so clear. The boundaries are blurring. Women have entered the workforce, and people take work home, and so on and so forth. But I think just as sort of the logic of capital as value, valorizing, it is actually important to see that capitalism always requires an outside that where other political relations are present and which govern them as well. And whether there are normative potentials there, where there's things like care, for instance, could be sourced and to critique the capitalist economy. Yes, I think so. But of course, precisely because capitalism requires these outsides and exploits them, that's why you can never, I don't think, have recourse to this sort of perfect outside that is untouched somehow, because it is always in the process of being paradoxically, integrated into the inside as well. So staying with the trouble, that would be the way to go.
I think that's a very nice way to end. Stay with the trouble. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for the audience for being here. And let's give an applause. And don't forget to buy Jan's book. If you're interested, you can buy it in the back.